welcome back. I'm lucky to have an amazing collection of great drums from a variety of different eras and manufacturers. I try to only collect instruments I actually plan on using and have a specific need for in the mix of other equipment I own, but of course, I own a few pieces that are really more of showroom-style pieces that live on a shelf. Now, in my defense, even for those showroom pieces, they're typically in a good enough condition where I could grab it off the shelf and use it. Back in the beginning of May, I was scrolling around Facebook Marketplace late on a Saturday night and discovered a newly listed Gretsch stop sign badge kit with a 20 by 14 inch bass drum, 12 by 8 inch rack tom, and a 14 by 14 inch floor tom in a beautiful walnut lacquer, and I wasted no time reaching out to the seller to inquire more and get a sense for any wiggle room in the price. Luckily, we were able to quickly work out a deal, and I went to pick these up the next day after a gig. Upon bringing them home, you'll see that in addition to the 3 drums I just mentioned, I was able to get him to throw in this Pearl Masters 4-ply snare for free. I was able to sell this off pretty quickly and cut down my total investment on these drums to just $700. After doing a little research, I learned these drums were from the very early 80s due to the extremely limited drop G style badge on all the shells. And for being over 40 years old, these drums were in mint condition and showed very little signs of wear. The next morning, I started by getting these drums back into a position where I could set them up and play them. I started with the floor tom and swapped out the random heads with a single ply coated batter and a clear reso head. By swapping out the heads, it also gave me a chance to look at the internal mufflers on both the top and bottom, which seemed to be in working order. I'm not a huge fan of these vintage Gretsch floor tom legs, but for now they'll work, and I was quickly able to move on to the rack tom. For the rack tom, I again swapped out the heads for the same combo as the floor tom, but when I got to the batter head, I also removed this suspension mount as it was pretty bulky and not anything original. This shell also did have the original tom mount, which was this style that used a hex rod, similar to Yamaha or Rogers drums. I'm not really a fan of this, and knew that I wanted to do something a bit different, so while I had this drum apart, I also removed this bracket, which left a pretty large hole in the side of the shell. I quickly ran over to grab one of my newer Gretsch Brooklyn drums to test and see if this diamond plate bracket might fit the 2 vertical holes while covering up the larger hole left on the shell from the older mount. After testing it out, I discovered the holes were maybe a 1/16th to an 1/8 of an inch too close together, and while the diamond shape of the bracket covered most of the hole left in the shell, it didn't cover up the gap entirely. I decided for now to just cover this hole with some gaff tape temporarily until I could get to work on it more, but then I added the top head back onto this drum and shifted my attention over to the bass drum. The bass drum had all the rims, claws, and tension rods, but was missing the front head. The owner actually had a head on this drum when I went to go look at it, but it was something custom painted for one of his old bands, so I told him he should keep it as it really had zero value to me and would be something he could maybe hang on the wall or keep as a memento. I think the fact that I did this was a nice peace offering as we were getting to know each other, and probably part of the reason he was willing to work with me and ended up throwing in that snare. I had a Gretsch logo head in my stock of spare drum heads, so I threw that on the front and then removed the original head from the batter side. I also removed this vintage tom bracket as it seemed to be a really poor design and worn out at this point, and I knew I wanted to replace this with something a little more sturdy, so I gave this the same treatment as the tom bracket and covered these holes up with some gaff tape for now. I went ahead and added an Aquarian Super Kick head for the batter, but I know in addition to the tom mount, I was also going to address the spurs on this drum as they were mounted on what I consider to be the wrong side. Typically on a bass drum, the tom bracket would be mounted closer to the resonant side than the batter, and on the same side you'd have your spurs. In addition, typically the badge on the shell would orient so the player behind the drums can read the name, but on this drum, it was backwards, which led me to believe that these spurs may have been some sort of aftermarket addition. I know a lot of older Gretsch drums were ordered into stores without being drilled for hardware like spurs and tom mounts, and so you'll find plenty of old Gretsch drums with hardware from other companies like Pearl or Yamaha. While these spurs worked okay, the functionality wasn't flawless, and since I knew I was already going to modify a few other aspects about this drum, I figured I'd also upgrade these spurs to something more roadworthy. After a bit of thought on how I wanted to make the changes to these drums, I sat down at my computer and put together an order for a few parts. The first was one of these Gretsch diamond plate tom brackets, and these are great because they actually feature 2 different hole patterns for both modern and vintage Gretsch drums. Next, I found one of the standard issue Gretsch base plates for a tom post. The surface area of these is pretty large, and I knew I'd be able to cover up the pre-existing holes on the shell and mask any holes I'd have to plug along the way. Lastly, I ordered some newer Gretsch bass drum spurs, and at this point, it just made sense to work with all Gretsch components. I know that these updates would disqualify this kit from being truly authentic, but at least I'd have the coordination of matching parts. While I waited for my parts to be delivered, I began the most challenging part of this restoration, plugging the 12-inch tom hole left by the old mounting hardware. I grabbed this cutoff from a 12-inch Yamaha Tour Custom shell, and I knew this would work great because the shell would share the exact same profile as any other 12-inch drum, and after measuring the thickness of the drum, I was able to confirm that they are roughly the same thickness as well. So I took this upstairs and cut off a segment that I could use to make my own custom plug. After sanding away at the black paint finish, I brought this segment back downstairs and traced out the outline of the hole by pressing the segment up from inside of the shell. I ended up running over to my dad's shop because I realized I didn't have the right tools for the job, but once I got to his place, I cut out this plug on a scroll saw, which allowed me to get really close, and then I took it over to the belt sander to get right up to the line I had traced. This worked great and allowed me to go back and forth between the tom shell and the sander to remove little amounts until I had a nice tight fit. On the way home, I stopped at my local hardware store and found a stain that I thought was a very close match to the original finish, and in this case, it was Varathane's Cabernet. When I got home, I added some stain to the outside of the plug and left this to dry overnight. While I waited for the plug to dry, I went downstairs and started the long process of removing every single lug and stuffing them with cotton balls, because after playing these drums, I could hear that springy sound coming from the lugs. I absolutely hate doing this, and it takes forever, but it really does make a huge difference once you muffle those springs in each lug. After finishing both toms, I took the bass drum upstairs and began plugging the holes left on the shell from the older tom mount. It had 2 larger holes where tom arms could pass through, and then 4 smaller holes where nuts and bolts would secure the bracket in place. For this, I just used the traditional method of gluing dowels in the holes and then coming back with a flush cut saw to trim them close to the shell. I didn't want to sand the plugs flush to the shell and sacrifice the beautiful finish on this drum, so instead, I tried to trim each plug prior. This worked well, and then to get even more precise, I came back with a file and got the plugs pretty much seamless with the shell. Before gluing them in, I also painted the inside of the plugs with aluminum fence paint, which I've used before to match Gretsch's famous silver sealer finish. After gluing them in place, I added the same finish to the top of the plugs that I used on the tom plug and could leave them to dry for a bit. Since I was able to get this done early enough, I actually decided to put these drums back together and bring them along with me later that night to a gig I had with my funk band, the Pocket Kings, outside right next to Lambeau Field in Green Bay. It was nice to try these drums in a musical application, and I had an absolute blast playing on them, and they sounded great.
What is it?
With my other vintage Gretsch kit, I struggled to tune the drums down low, and I think that's in part to the toms on older round badge drums not having vent holes. These drums, on the other hand, sat perfectly in lower tunings, and the dual internal mufflers allowed me to dial in the sustain on both the top and bottom heads. The next day, I was able to glue the tom plug in place, and I'm not joking when I say the tom bracket was literally delivered when I was working on this, allowing me to go ahead and get the tom bracket installed as well. And not to get too sidetracked, But when I opened up this package, I was extremely humbled to see a handwritten note from an employee at the store where I ordered this from, thanking me for my order and letting me know they watch my videos. So shout out to Sam at Chuck Levin's Music if you end up watching this. Like I mentioned before, the holes that were already there were just a bit too close together to fit this bracket, so typically I'd use a drill and widen the hole a bit, but a couple weeks before I was hanging out with a friend and fellow Gretsch nerd, Connor Dennis from the band Beartooth, and he had mentioned using a file for these sorts of things, and that worked great and allowed me to have much more control as I widened up this hole a bit. The next part to come in was the bass drum plate, and I didn't waste too much time before getting to drilling out the new holes to get this mounted. I've covered this process before, but my best advice is to measure as many times as you can. Measure from every reference point you can, and double check it as many times as you need to feel confident drilling out these holes. There's a blueprint for this mount that I got on a Gretsch Facebook group, and I'll share it here for you to screenshot if you need it. I remember the first time I ever did this, and it was terrifying. I've done it so many times now that I feel way more relaxed about it, but it's still pretty scary when you're drilling through a drum that costs well over $1,000, or worse, a drum that's vintage and irreplaceable. After getting the tom bracket installed, I also finally got around to adding cotton balls to these lugs as well. A few days later, the last of the parts I had ordered arrived, and in addition to the bass drum spurs I mentioned earlier, I decided to pick up some new heads, as I'm really partial to this combination of clear ambassadors on the Rezo and coated vintage ambassadors on the batter side. It's a combination that I've found to be pretty versatile for tuning high on jazz and bebop, and low enough for funk, pop, and anything else I might play. I reheaded the floor tom, and then moved on to this rack tom. While I had the rack tom apart, I took this last chance to touch up some paint and stain on both the inside and outside of the shell, and taking the time to do this really made a huge difference in my opinion. After letting it dry for a bit, I was able to add back the tom mount along with new heads and call this drum complete. With new spurs ready to be installed, I grabbed the bass drum and started by removing the older spurs. Once I had them removed, I added some tape to the shell and poked holes through the tape where I needed to plug. This just helped avoid any glue squeeze out from getting on the finish and ruining how pristine it already looked. I glued in the dowels and came back with a flush cut saw, being very careful to avoid scratching the shell, and after that, I came back with the file and tried again to get flush with the shell and avoid scratching it along the way. I added stain to the outside of the shell where the plugs were, and then came back to the inside and added more of the silver sealer to the dowels, and even though this is a really small detail that won't be seen from the outside, it just wouldn't feel right skipping over it when it's so simple to do. After plugging up all the older holes, I came back and drilled out for the new spurs, again being very careful to make sure my placement was exactly as I wanted before drilling the holes. What's nice about these rubber gaskets they included is that they're a great template to line up on your drum and use as a guide for spacing holes. After drilling out all 8 holes, I could bring this drum over to my workbench and attach the spurs for good, and get these heads back on both sides of the drum, and finally call this project complete. I had to wait a few weeks before I could make time to record a proper demo, but I tried to showcase the versatility of these drums from lower rock tunings up to higher jazz tunings. For this demo, I paired these shells up with my 70s stop sign badge aluminum snare, and for the mics, I used an SE Electronics V-Kick on the bass drum, a Shure SM57 on the snare, 2 Sennheiser E604s for both toms, as well as a pair of Shure KSM 137s in an XY configuration for the overheads. demo does a good job at showcasing the versatility of these drums, and for me, that's really what excited me about this kit the most. As much as I love my 60s round badge kit, I found it to be best when it's tuned up high for jazz. When I do that, it sounds amazing, but whenever I try to tune it low for a more dead, tubby sound, I find it to be a bit of a struggle with getting the toms to settle in. These drums, on the other hand, sit so well in low tunings, and I have no issues getting that vibey, muffled tone that I associate with vintage drums. To me, when I choose to record on a modern kit, I'm usually hearing more sustain and clear, pure tone, but when I call on vintage drums, I want it to have more of a vibe and character. These drums do exactly that. I'd be lying if I said these drums are 100% perfect with every note I play, and I did have to bring the rack tom over to do some work to remove a little rattle at one point, but I think that's just part of what you accept when you choose to use vintage drums. They're temperamental and require more attention and occasional maintenance, much like an older car. A couple other small details that I may change over time include the floor tom legs and mounts. These thinner vintage mounts work fine and hold up well, but I've noticed no matter how secure you tighten them in place, they still have a tendency to wobble a bit. I've seen other drummers swap out these brackets for the same diamond bracket I ordered for the rack tom, and with the multiple hole patterns Gretsch includes on those brackets, you can swap these out without doing any extra drilling. At the time of doing this project, I didn't really feel like spending the money to buy 3 more of these brackets, along with 3 floor tom legs, but if I do end up using this kit regularly for gigs, I'm pretty sure the investment would be validated. The other small detail I might change deals with the bass drum, and more specifically the T-handle style tension rods. These T-rods are pretty common on all sorts of vintage kits, and I appreciate the convenience of avoiding the need for a drum key, but if you've ever walked next to a bass drum and have gotten caught on one of these, you know how annoying it can be. Additionally, the perfectionist in me just can't stand seeing all of these T-handles being oriented randomly around the drum. On top of that, I don't like the idea of storing these drums vertically and having all that weight supported by just the T-heads. If I were to swap out these tension rods, I'd surely keep the original T-headed rods on hand just in case I ever sold the kit, but it'd be relatively cheap to change, and it would make my life a lot easier as I use them. So to conclude, I've become totally infatuated with these drums, and they have found a home in both my studio and on the bandstand. In today's world, it can be a challenge to find a good deal, especially on vintage drums. I do a lot of window shopping through all the great drum shops across the country and on Reverb, but finding a kit close to home and meeting the owner who held on to them for the last 20 years adds some special sentimental value to these drums for me. I'd love to hear what you think about these drums, so leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on all of my future video releases. And until next time, thanks.